Hi, I'm Lenina Rasool and welcome to Mental Health Matters on Cape Town TV, where we discuss all things mental health and more. Today we're going to be speaking about burnout, what it is, what's the difference between normal tiredness and exhaustion versus a clinical disorder that prevents you from functioning normally in the workplace. After the break, we're going to be speaking to Professor Karin Calitz, who wrote a paper about burnout and where it stands in the medical and legal fields and what we can do about this if we're experiencing it. But before that, we're going to have a look at a video about depression, because this is the closest that we can get to burnout, and also it's a result and consequence of having burnout. So let's have a look.
Depression is a sustained low mood that lasts for a long time. So we all feel a little bit sad and a little bit down once in a while, especially on a Monday morning. However, depression is a lot more serious than that. Depression is when somebody feels really sad for a long time. In fact, it's when a person really feels downtrodden by life and feels as if nothing in that moment is going to make it feel or get any better. So really what we want to define depression as is a mood that is very low, that has associated symptoms like fatigue and feeling guilty and feeling tired and feeling as if there is no tomorrow, that lasts for approximately 3 weeks to 3 months. There are a lot of places where one person can get help for their depression. Usually I like to categorize them in 3 different places. The first one is a hospital or a clinic. Now, South Africa has primary healthcare clinics, tertiary healthcare clinics, and local community clinics where somebody can go there, speak to a professional, and try and get some help. The second one are your private psychiatrists and psychologists, to the extent that you can afford it. Making an appointment with one of those professionals is a really good step in trying to get help. The third category includes non-profit organizations and non-governmental organizations, or NPOs and NGOs, such as the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, or SADC. These are organizations that go out into the communities and avail themselves for little money in order to offer you some help. There's a lot of things that one can do to help themselves. Now, this must not be confused with the idea that one person can cure their own depression. Oftentimes, it really does need professional help. Though maybe we can look at some of those things that someone can do by themselves to assist themselves. The first one is exercise and keeping a healthy physical activity in your regimen. Going for a walk, going for a run, engaging in recreational activities is really important. Play some soccer, join some friends for some frisbee, or just take a swift walk to your local shops or wherever you need to go. We know that exercise is incredibly helpful. Secondly is diet. Now, we often say you are what you eat, though we also ignore that. We really know that a good diet can really help with the depression. Firstly, it can help to make the depression better in many ways, and secondly, it can help to keep you happy and healthy. The third one is how you socialize. Now, when a person is depressed, oftentimes they do not want to be around people, engage, socialize, and we understand that. Though we also do know that keeping the right company and the right amount of socializing and interaction and finding and nurturing relationships can really be helpful. It can also allow you to have a support system that alerts you when something is wrong and assists you in trying to find help. Hey, you might even be able to get some humor and a good laugh out of there, and that is some medicine, good enough medicine as well.
How do you help a loved one who has depression?
Helping a loved one with depression is very important. Now, there are several things that you can do to try and be of assistance to a loved one with depression. The first one is just be there for them. Just to sit with them, listen to them, and find out what's wrong. Ask the relevant questions. Ask questions that will not make them feel as if they're doing this themselves, or they're being lazy, or that there's something wrong with them. Instead, they are struggling with something. Help them understand what is wrong with them. Do some research yourself. Oftentimes, we know that people who are struggling with depression do not understand that there is something that they're struggling with that they can get help with. Go on the internet, speak to professionals, call this Life Care Depression and Anxiety group to understand their symptoms, their behaviors, and what it is that they might be struggling with, and have a conversation with them. Then maybe be supportive in trying to get the right type of help. It is difficult for anyone with depression to even get up, let alone to get up and go get assistance when the depression is really bad. They may need some support in helping them through this very difficult journey. They may need you to help them make appointments or even get to those appointments and encourage them to keep on with their medication. There are very many things that we may want to say to somebody who has depression which may not be helpful, even though we think we're trying to be helpful. The first one, and the most common one, is snap out of it. Now, I often wonder if we would say that to somebody, say, with a fractured arm or who's struggling with heart disease, it would seem unfair. It is the same with depression. Somebody with depression cannot snap out of it. In fact, that statement or statements like that can oftentimes make them feel worse. It can make them feel as if they're doing this to themselves. Be strong. You need to be strong for yourself or other people is another problematic statement. We also know that people with depression, in fact, have been strong for too long, and that has weighed down on them. It might be helpful to say, hey, you're struggling, I can see that. It's horrible and uncomfortable, and at the same time, it's okay. Telling somebody with depression that they're being lazy or they're not getting off their back is also not really helpful. We know that one of the symptoms of depression is finding it difficult to get up in the morning. Depression does not have to be the disease and the disorder that disables the world as it does at the moment. We can really beat depression. We can speak about it in order to allow other people to feel comfortable to say, hey, I also struggle with depression once in a while, or I've beaten depression. And that's the message that we need to get to. We need to move from a place of speaking about mental illness and psychiatric conditions to speaking about mental wellness. And speaking about depression and beating it is one of the places to start. Let's beat depression.
Welcome back. You're still watching Mental Health Matters, and today we are speaking about burnout. And joining me in studio is Professor Karin Calitz, who is a law professor and has written a paper on burnout. Karin, thank you so much for joining us.
That is my pleasure, Lenina. I love speaking about this topic because it's so important.
It is. Thank you, Professor. I just want to ask, burnout is a huge topic. A lot of people are speaking about it, but they are not speaking about it sort of in the context of how serious it is. And so you wrote a paper about the legitimacy of burnout in the medical and legal fields, or the lack of legitimacy. I wanted to ask, what led you to this topic?
Lenina, I'm glad you asked me about that. The reason is that through the years, I've seen people burning out around me, colleagues, family, friends, and I was very worried about them. And I thought, what can I do? I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a psychologist. What can I do? And I thought, okay, I'm a labor law lecturer, so maybe I can do some research to find out what is this burnout precisely. What are the causes of it? What are the effects of it? How can you prevent it? So that's why I started researching. And I must say, burnout is, the word is thrown around a lot of times, and we have a vague idea of what it is, but no one is very precise about it. So when I started doing the research, I thought, will I ever get an academic article or medical article about this? Maybe it's just, some popular articles on blogs and so on. And I was so surprised when I started reading. There are hundreds of articles about burnout, And then I started reading about this, and it was so interesting. I thought, okay, maybe I can contribute a little bit by this research, so that the people are sensitized about what burnout is, what are the causes, so that it can be prevented. And if it happens, then what are the remedies for this illness?
Thank you, Karin. And I mean, I have to say, I had the same experience. And so, when you look sort of on the surface, a lot of the articles are around, are you burning out? I mean, my perspective is even something that you'll see in magazines as opposed to newspapers or journals. And that's why I was so excited to find your paper. Specifically, you spoke about the history of the term burnout and when it first originated, meaning sort of total exhaustion. And so I wanted to ask you if you can just give us more context on what you found in terms of the definitions of burnout.
These researchers, Christina Maslach and her colleague Leiter, sociologist, they established the Maslach Burnout Index, MBI for short. And almost every article talking about, our academic articles and not just popular, they start with explaining what the Maslach Burnout MBI Index is about. So there are 4 dimensions to burnout identified by these researchers. And those are total physical and emotional exhaustion. And then the second dimension is cynicism or detachment. So it means that people detach them from, in the health services, they detach them from their patients. So they are a bit cynical about their work. And it's only not because they're bad people, but because they want to protect themselves. And the third dimension is a feeling of inefficiency. So the person doesn't believe that they can do anything valuable anymore. And then there was a fourth one added, and that is mental impairment. So people can't, as one woman explained it, my brain didn't want to do now when I was burnt out what it did previously for me. So you can't think as you used to think in the past. I can also enlarge on this a bit and talk about it if you want me to, or should we move on to another part of the topic?
Yes, please. If you could just tell us a bit more about it, because I think, part of the issue when we speak about there not being proper, I think, narrative around burnout, what I always worry about is that people, and this happens a lot with mental health, they don't realize what they are going through while they are experiencing it. So if you could give us more context, that would be wonderful.
Yes, certainly, that's very important. People don't know. And that's why I think there should be knowledge about this. It should be disseminated and it should be talked about because there's a lack of knowledge from the side of employees and also from employers. So if we can speak about this and give it a name, burnout, and we know what burnout means, then we have a handle to try and prevent it and to have remedies for it. But if it's not defined and people just brandish it about as a popular term, then we won't get any further. So, yes, total exhaustion, I think that is easy, but if I can explain it, a colleague of mine said, I was so exhausted that I couldn't open my email. I couldn't read it. My brain didn't want to go there. Another person said, I was exhausted, but one day I realized that I was exhausted. But one day I just totally caved in, and I thought I was having a heart attack. And then later on, I realized this was burnout. So that happens to people. They are totally exhausted. Then there's cynicism, as I explained, the detachment. In our academic world, it's lecturers will, for instance, they will detach from students. It means that they won't care as deeply as previously because it's too much for them for that care, and especially people in the health professions, that happens. And then the third one, feelings of inefficiency. So people lose their sense of their own value. They think, well, I'm not worth anything. I can't contribute anything. And if that happens, they really can't do anything because they don't have that self-confidence that I have the background, I can do it, I'm valuable. And then, of course, they are inefficient. And the fourth one is mental impairment. As I said, a lady who suffered from burnout said, my brain didn't want to do what it did previously. So it's just that your thought processes are not what it should be. So those are the four, as they call it, dimensions. You can also call it symptoms of burnout. Yes, that's it.
Thank you, Professor. That's very helpful. And I think that also, as you're speaking, I can, I've spoken out before about some of my experiences in workplaces, and some of the things that you're saying is very, very important and relevant. And when you were speaking about detachment, for example, I thought, sometimes it starts at work, but also it spills over into home. And I can almost see that, as a mother, you're so focused on the physical things that you still have to do, like feeding and dressing and bathing, but this detachment is a very, very real thing that spills over at home also. And is that some of the narrative that came out as a result of the burnout?
Yes, and that's really, it jeopardizes the health of the family, because there's, a mother can't take care of her children properly if she's burnt out. That is just impossible. And of course, that has an impact on the children. What will happen to them when they are adults and they haven't had the proper care from their mothers and their fathers. And I must just say that there's a gender dimension to burnout, in that more women burn out than men, and especially young women. And it's not difficult to realize that this is because women still they still have the most responsibilities around children and the home and so on. So that's why they burn out. And in a recent survey in the US, it was found that more than 70% of employees indicated that they suffer from burnout. And most of those, a high percentage, I think almost more than 40% of those people were women, and mostly young women. And many of them said that they are thinking of resigning because they just can't take this anymore. And of course, this was exacerbated by COVID, when young mothers, also fathers, not only women, but I mean, more women than men, they said that they can't keep up with working at home, the blurring of the lines between work and home, the extra responsibilities of having to homeschool children and so forth. I think that is the debate that we've all heard about, but it exacerbated burnout during COVID. But it doesn't mean that now it's not relevant or jeopardizes many things at the workplace, like productivity, because of illness leave, because of some people, the consequences of this, that people turn to the abuse of prescription medicine or even alcohol, or they overeat, things like that happen, and also to their really serious health problems, because stress hormones are released in the bloodstream if you are anxious, and if you're on the point of burnout, more of those. And then there's not sufficient blood going to the brain and the heart. So you can suffer from ischemic heart disease and ischemic strokes. So it has very, very serious consequences. The workplace productivity will, of course, go down. And if employers, I know there are many sympathetic employers, but some just don't have the knowledge about burnout, and they don't see that if persons have a healthy work-life balance and they have family time and they rest, they have sufficient rest, that they will be more productive than when they work round the clock and they're available 24 hours of the day.
Yes, I mean, that makes so much sense. I'm remembering, actually, I think one of the posts that I did once during, and it was during the lockdown, but I mean, generally also, I was just saying, it's so weird. It's difficult to sort of get my head around the fact that I'm doing this really important meeting, and straight after that, I'm heading to the bathroom to go and wash school socks, and the difference between these two tasks and identities. But they're both equally important. You know, you need the clean socks for
Exactly.
school.
Yes.
I want to ask, you mentioned you brought in the employers, and I just wanted to ask you about some of your findings around the effect of burnout on the workplace. We've seen statistics also showing that decreased productivity, but increased absenteeism, but also specifically, I know I've seen that depression, which is sort of in the bundle of burnout, also, you know, it hits the bottom line, it affects the profits. And so I wanted to ask just some of the findings that you can share with us and hopefully with employers out there about how burnout and stress and depression affects their workplace.
Yes, it has a profound effect on the workplace because if someone suffers from burnout and they are booked off, as we say, and they can't come to work for a period, then there's another colleague that will have to take responsibility for their work. And I've seen that it's like a domino effect. Because one goes, the other one is already stressed and depressed and almost burned out. So that person must now do two persons' work. And then they are also burned out. So that is the problem with burnout that is not treated efficiently, that it will spread through the workplace. And eventually, yes, lower productivity, and then the public health system, because people will go to hospital to be treated for this, that will also suffer. And of course, if many workplaces suffer, then the economy won't be as it should be. There will also be an impact on the economy as a whole, because many workdays are lost through mental illnesses. This costs the workplace, it costs the economy. So it's a wider problem than just only one workplace.
Thank you, Karin. You know, you're bringing in the economy, and one of the things, you know, as I was reading your paper, was thinking about the fact that we are living in and moving towards a large knowledge economy now. This is, you know, people speak about this a lot, the fourth industrial revolution, and I had read a paper a long while back by Peter Drucker, who has, you know, before the knowledge economy, he predicted it, and he spoke about managing oneself, really just the management, but specifically the fact that we can't measure sort of our knowledge output. And it's always fascinating to me, you know, when you are, let's say, in a factory, for example, and your target is so many garments a day or so many, you know, specific pieces of things a day. And one of the things that I had wondered about throughout my career after reading his piece is, how do I don't know how to measure when my brain is, I don't know how to measure when my brain is tired. I can feel that I'm not able to, for example, write this article right now. The words are not making sense. I need to go sleep. But I can't, I don't know how to explain that to someone. Explain output really in the context of, you know, something that's not so tangible. Do you think the fact that we in an increasing knowledge economy contributes to this?
I'm sure it contributes, and as you say, people are unsure. You know, am I now just a bit tired? Is my output sufficient? Why am I now tired? I think I haven't done enough, and yes, it's difficult to just decide about that for yourself. So that is why we should look at the dimensions of burnout, and you should test yourself and think about yourself, and then perhaps go and see a doctor or a psychologist. Talk to your employer. That's sometimes very difficult to do that. But I think if there's more openness about this, because many people just will keep silent because they will feel, well, I'm not going to tell people how I feel, because that means perhaps that I'm not capable. And look at those around me, they're all coping. So what about me? But I think there should be openness about this, and one should talk about it more. I know that people sometimes take sick leave, but they don't tell anyone what's really happening to them, or they would even take their vacation leave just to recuperate at home and just keep quiet about this, and then go back to work and try to start again, you know, and hope that they will be refreshed. So I know that there are some large firms that already in their HR department, they have uh, regular talks with people, with employees, and they tell them, this is a red flag, this is a red flag. Just keep an eye on yourself, and that's important because employees also have a responsibility to look after their own health. But I mean, if you have a very heavy workload, if there are tight deadlines, you don't have any support, you have long work hours that your employer expects of you, then where's the time for exercise? Where's the time for relaxation? Where's the time to be with your family? You can look after yourself, but if you don't have the time for that and you're overburdened, then the employer must do something. And what some employers do, and this is not employer bashing, I think it's just that employers are not always, they don't have the knowledge about this burnout. And what they sometimes say is they almost place the blame on the employee, and they say, well, you should prioritize. And you should organize your workload, things like that. Or, yes, we have a wellness program. You should, participate in that. But as someone said to me, yes, you can participate in a wellness program, but that will take you a few hours. And when I get back to my desk, I will just have more work to do. So that's also not the solution to say, well, please go off and look after yourself, do the wellness. If the root problem is overload, then the employer will have to do something about that.
Yes, that makes so much sense. And it sounds so familiar because I know I've been in workplaces that have had sort of wellness, and it might not have been programs, but activities. And one of the things that we're always trying to do is not having the time to actually go to the wellness activity, because
that's ironic. Yes,
emails would build up and so forth. Karin, we need to take a short break. I mean, this is a wonderful conversation, but we're going to take a short break and we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back to Mental Health Matters. We are still on air, and in this episode we are speaking about burnout, and joining us in studio is Professor Karin Calitz, who wrote a paper about burnout, and we've been discussing this. And so, Karin, when we left off, you were speaking about sort of aspects of the workplace, and one of the things that jumped out at me from your paper was the cause and effect section. And it was interesting because it wasn't just sort of an increased or a really huge workload. There were really other things that were reminiscent almost of a toxic workplace. So some of the things was unfairness also played a role, lack of recognition. And I know, if I think about sort of business articles that I read, sometimes these things are framed sort of individually. It was interesting for me to see it grouped together as contributors to burnout. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about that.
Yes, certainly. Well, there are certain factors. We could call it the workplace culture. In every workplace, there's a different culture. And as you say, it could be toxic. So the things that have been identified is the hierarchical system. If there's a tight hierarchy and employees don't have a voice. They are managers, and their word is kind of the law. So that could lead to burnout. Also, when employees are not rewarded for what they do at the firm. So in reward, it's not always financial rewards. It's also appreciation. When someone is told your value for this firm, etc., etc. So it's not always about financial reward, so that we should remember. And then also, if employees, their value system differ from the companies. That, for instance, just an example, if there's a company spilling chemical waste into a river, and the employee knows this, and they think, well, I cannot work for a place where this happens. and perhaps they speak about it, then they're whistleblowers, and well, the consequences of that. But if there's a difference between the value system of the employer and employee, that could also lead to burnout. And also some things like, when there's a lot of pressure to just work very long hours, to, yes, like a capitalist kind of view that people should work around the clock. And it sometimes goes out from the top, where the top people, the managers, they work around the clock, they send emails late at night, and without explicitly expecting this from employees will also feel, well, that's what I also have to do, and that can lead to burnout. And also the group is very important. If you don't have support from your colleagues, then it could also lead to burnout. So that group cohesion is very important. So it has been found that where there's such a group cohesion and there's support from colleagues, you won't burn out as quickly as when you are totally on your own. Then also the voice of employees are very important, as I've said. And if there's unfairness, when decisions are taken. And it's not just about, well, a decision is taken and now I won't get a pay raise. It's about input from the employee. So if there's fairness, I have a voice, I can participate, and there's transparency about what is happening in the workplace. And it's not just kept closed and I'm just informed. So employees need that, to know that they can also make an input, and they have a voice, and they are important in this aspect.
Thank you, Karin. I wanted to ask, there was one thing that was also listed, which I found fascinating, was a discrepancy between employers' expectations and, let's say, job description. And I want to sort of put forward an experience even that I had, once where, I work in communications. There were two of us hired who were supposed to work in tandem. But what I found was that, and let's say, for example, the other person is struggling sort of with the workload, and a lot of that work was being passed on to me. That was not in my job description, but I was doing sort of the work of two people. When we speak about voice, me having raised it, and I often say, it is so difficult to go to HR if there is an HR person, because there isn't always an HR person, especially in smaller organizations. But it's so difficult because you're essentially sort of reporting your boss or your manager, and then you still have to work with this person afterwards. And so that's always like a really difficult thing to do. But when we talk about how did that show up in the research you were doing in terms of what the job description is versus what the employer expects? And I want to add that, even job descriptions these days, I find it so interesting where they use words like flexibility, or should be available after hours, or should not be restricted. We're seeing a lot of that now in job descriptions. And I mean, I often find it quite alarming. So did this show up as you were doing interviews and the research?
Yes, it did. And you're quite right. When you enter a workplace, and there's often this contract or this job description, which is very wide, which is advantageous to employers, because it's now so wide, then you, as an employee, don't really know what's expected, but they make it as wide as possible to cover themselves. And then you get into the job and you see, well, this is not what I thought. So that if there are different views of what this job would be like, your view is quite different from your employer's, perhaps because of this wide job description is not very specific. And then you get to the workplace, and as you said, you have to do the work of your colleague as well. That could really lead to serious burnout. And how to raise this? I mean, it is very difficult to raise this. I think what can be done in such a case is is to bring in a mediator, perhaps to have mediation by someone senior, but maybe, as you've said, it can be a small workplace. And then what can you do? I mean, there's no one to mediate this. So I agree that is a problem. I don't have a solution for that, especially as you said, you have to speak to your employer, you have to be open about it, but then you have to work with this person again, and perhaps he's or she is not sympathetic to you. So that's a real problem. I agree.
Karin, thank you. So I want to ask, so we've been, you know, essentially Mental Health Matters is around mental health, and we've been talking about the effects of burnout, that the effects of stress and how this can affect the body, and also the resultant, I think, depression is a huge factor that sets in under the umbrella of burnout. And, you know, and yet, in your paper, it was mentioned that, you know, burnout hasn't really been accepted as a disorder by the World Health Organization. And so I just wanted to ask you to clarify a little bit about that. So we've looked at the 4 dimensions of burnout. It can be, you know, detachment, total exhaustion. It can even lead to people feeling, you know, a sense of incompetency and actually affect their ability to do their job. And yet it is not sort of officially recognized. Where is the space here? If people are sitting at home, they are struggling with their mental health, they think it's burnout, but burnout sounds like it's not a serious thing. How do we think about this from a sort of medical perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the World Health Organization, they gave recognition to burnout, not as an illness, but as a phenomenon. But at least they've acknowledged it, and they use the same dimensions. They say that burnout is something like chronic workplace stress that's not managed sufficiently or efficiently. And they mention the dimensions that we've talked about, the exhaustion, the cynicism, and also the sense of inefficiency. As part of the definition. So they've now gone some step in the right way to just use the word burnout at least, but still it's not an illness in terms of the ICD-11 categories, which is the newest categories for chronic diseases by the World Health Organization. But they're moving in the right direction. So I think this is very good, and it is very positive. I think what will help is a code to adopted by government. If that is, burnout is given legitimacy, if it's called by its name, because nowhere in legislation you get that term burnout. And I think it's important that there's a code, perhaps combined with the right to disconnect. We didn't touch on that. I don't know if you want me to talk about that.
Yes, please.
So that burnout is treated in the workplace like it is a disease. It's a very serious disease. So many people are burning out. It has taken on epidemic proportions in the world of work in the last few years, and it's just growing. So it's getting worse. So in many countries, they do acknowledge it. People can claim from their workmen's compensation fund if they are disabled and they cannot work for a period. But in South Africa, there's nothing like that. I just want to go a bit back on the protection that is there at the moment. It is not sufficient, but there is a duty on employers to ensure the health and safety of their employees. Okay? That's a common law duty. And this common law duty has been given effect in legislation by the Occupational Health and Safety Act. But that act was adopted in 1993 already. So at that stage, people were not really thinking about mental health. So the whole Occupational Health and Safety Act is focused on physical injuries and diseases. And as I've said, mental illnesses have overtaken physical injuries and diseases in the world of work. It's now much more prevalent than physical diseases. So there should be acknowledgement of this. So in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, an employer is obliged to make a risk assessment, to see what can happen in this workplace that is detrimental to employees. How will they be? How can they be injured? Perhaps what should I do to prevent this? But nowhere there's anything about mental health. So it should be explicitly included in our Occupational Health and Safety Act. And further, and that will prevent it in a way, or help to prevent it. And further, our compensation for injuries and diseases, that's also only focused on physical and injuries and diseases. So people with mental illnesses and burnout should be able to claim compensation if they are disabled, if they cannot work for a while, then they should be able to claim. And they can in theory claim, but it's very difficult because as it is not mentioned on the list of diseases that employees can claim for, the onus is on the employee to prove that they suffer burnout or a mental illness as a result of the workplace. And that's sometimes very difficult. So it should be explicitly, although there is implicitly, we can say that there is a duty on the employee, they can perhaps claim from the Occupational Health and Safety Act, but it will be difficult for them. And so we have to make it easier for them. And what else, Lenina, should I touch on?
Okay, before, I do want to ask you about the right to disconnect, but before we go there, I just also want to ask, because you're speaking about sort of, what the work environment and the duty on the employer, but I also wanted to touch on that we have this culture also of overworking. So let's say as employees, as society, there is we see this not just in burnout articles, but generally that we glorify busyness. And we, working overtime or finishing this, and the way we speak about it equates to being superhuman, and the one who's the busiest is sort of like the best. And I just want to ask you something, around that. Do you see that? Is that something that the employer could say, like, well, I'll use an example in terms of taking leave. People might not take their leave, and the employer could say, well, that's not my fault. But is there an aspect, is that something that the people considered, that you spoke to, the employees considered? Did they feel safe to be able to take their leave or to not work overtime?
Yes, that depends totally on the workplace culture, and it comes from the top. Okay. So if your manager, your employer sends emails late at night, 3 o'clock in the morning, implicitly you will feel that that's also expected of you to be available around the clock and to work all hours, to give your everything, because that's what you must do in the workplace. And that is very, very detrimental to everyone. I just want to quote Elon Musk. He recently said, no one has ever changed the world on 40 hours a week. So that is the attitude of many people. Let's work ourselves to death. And that happens. People do work themselves to death. And that should be stopped. So managers, employers should set the example of a healthy lifestyle, work-family balance, and not to work at night and in your personal time. And this is the situation in Germany, and some of the big German companies, like I'm thinking of one car manufacturing company, they have a system in terms of which they is a program, a computer program, in terms of which emails and calls cannot go out from the office after work. And this is very important because they say that employees who have proper rest are more productive. So we don't want them to work at night. That brings me to the right to disconnect. May I talk about it, Lenina, or not yet?
Yes, I just wanted to, we need to have another quick break, and I wanted us to have the
Yes.
break before we go to Right to Disconnect. But I did want to say, you
Right.
know, one of the things I was looking up was actually the introduction of the weekend, which is cited to be done by Henry Ford. And it was interesting, it was in the early 1920s, but it was interesting to me because he also then at that point said, if workers have rest, I think if workers have sufficient rest, they will be more productive, and they were and it was found to be true. So it's interesting that so many years later we are sort of looking at that again. But as I said, we need to take a short break, and we'll be back with more after this.
Thank you.
Welcome back. You're still watching Mental Health Matters, and we have been in conversation with Professor Karin Calitz, who is a law professor and wrote a paper around burnout, and that's what we've been discussing. And Karin, you know, we've had this like really rich conversation. We've been looking at sort of burnout, what it is, the definitions of it, the four dimensions in terms of how burnout is described, and then also, you know, the question of legitimacy and whether it's been recognized in, you know, the medical field and the legal field. Where we left off was talking about sort of overworking and working after hours, and how this can be a workplace culture for people to take work home with them, to respond to messages, and how a lot of that culture comes from the top. And you were going to go in to talk about some of the solutions that are available for us to consider, one of them being the right to disconnect, which is practiced in some other countries. And so could you explain to us, what is the right to disconnect? What does it mean? What does it look like? And how is it being implemented in other spaces?
The right to disconnect means simply that after work hours, you have the right not to answer your phone and not to answer emails that comes from the workplace or is work-related, not to answer WhatsApps and so on. At the moment, we don't have any legislation or any code in that regard. Many European countries have that. The Americans not, because they have a culture of, you know, you should be available and work around the clock, although there's a lot of debate about that at the moment in the US. So the right to disconnect, it started in France in 2002 with an employee who refused to take files home and to work on those files after hours. The employer dismissed this person. He went to court, and the court said, you're quite right, you don't have to do that, you don't have a duty. And France was the first country who introduced legislation on the right to disconnect in 2016. And they require employers to establish a code at each workplace. So it needn't be the same for every workplace, because some workplaces need you to work at different hours and so on. So, but there must be personal time. You don't have to work during your personal time. So, what is interesting is that the employers have to sit down with the trade unions, and they must design such a code for each workplace. And other countries followed, like Belgium, the Netherlands, and so on. They all have a right to disconnect. So I think if we have a code in South Africa about dealing with mental illness, including burnout, it should also refer to this right to disconnect.
Wow, that is very fascinating, Karin. And I'm thinking about also, I mean, the aspect of it obviously is to have this code, or the purpose of it is that if you do not respond to emails, then you cannot, as this employee initially was, be fired or be penalized for it, but rather that it would then be okay, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm now thinking about someone I talked to who suffered from burnout. She said burnout took a year out of her life. And she said now she learned a few lessons. The one is that she has two phones. The one is a work phone and the other one a private. And the work phone she doesn't answer. Maybe she has an arrangement with her employer, because some employers in South Africa can still insist on it, because there's no right to disconnect at the moment. But she said, yes, okay, I don't answer that phone. I don't answer emails. I have my private phone. But she said, my colleagues still take their chances with me, and they sometimes contact me. So I have to be very strict to set the boundaries and say, listen, this is my family time. This is my personal time. So that's one way in doing it, to have these two phones and just not answer the one that's your work phone.
And so, Karin, I mean, as you're delving into all of these things, I mean, there has been the health aspect, there has been the psychological aspect, and I know, when one does research as a journalist with me, you're sort of looking at sort of all of the sides and speaking to lots of different people, including psychologists and so forth, to see, what are the alternatives, how do we sort of recognize these things, and has anything emerged both from people who decided to address their burnout, or to try and heal their burnout, and from some professional stakeholders that you might have spoken to if people are at home. And I think, really speaking to people who are struggling with burnout right now, what are some of the things that they can do to manage it, whether you've come across anything?
Mm-hmm. Well, they can manage their own lifestyle, if that is possible. As we've said, they can try and yes, they can exercise, they can rest, they can do things like that. But as we've said, if they are expected to work these long hours and to have a certain output, and they cannot do that, then it won't work. But some people you get personality types that drive themselves, and we all know those people that they are very ambitious, they are perfectionists, and therefore they drive themselves. But that is my concern as a labor law teacher, is with the side of the employer. What can the employer do? Because it's the responsibility of the employee as well, but okay, the employer. So I don't really have a solution for this, Lenina, because with us, it's still a hush-hush topic to a great extent. And people will be afraid because the employer perhaps doesn't know about what is burnout. It's difficult to approach the employer. And that's why I say I think we should have open discussions about this. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity to speak to you. So there should be openness, there should be transparency. Employers should, in a sense, be trained, and this will help if we have a code which has all this information. And there are lots of things that could go into such a code. We have many codes of good practice in South Africa. Some of the things that are addressed now in a new code is bullying and sexual harassment, and I haven't said anything about that, but that is also something that contributes to burnout. And the word that is used these days is the employer must ensure a safe psychosocial workplace, not only a safe physical workplace, but a safe psychosocial. And all those things will feed into this effort to ensure a safe psychosocial workplace. So you must look at, is there danger of bullying? Is there danger of sexual harassment? Long work hours. South Africans work amongst the some of the longest work hours in the world, 50 hours per average. That is it has been shown by research that people working 50 hours or more have a 39% bigger chance that to get heart failure, to suffer from a stroke, etc. So that is very dangerous. And I also think we should have a 40-hour work week, like many other countries. We have a 45-hour work week, and then people can also work overtime. So that's why it can get to 50 hours a week. So that's also an important aspect where I think that legislation should be amended.
Thank you so much, Karin. We are out of time. I want to also say, we played a video in the beginning around depression, and while burnout isn't, I think, just formally and officially recognizes the disease, I do want to say that maybe one pathway is to when you're feeling overwhelmed and you're feeling sort of inefficient or you're feeling as if you can't function, a lot of those symptoms, you know, murder depression, or depression is a result of burnout. And so to try and go and look at those resources, to try and go and have a look at the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. And Karin, I just want to thank you so much for your time and for your insights and for everything that you shared with us today.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me to participate in the program.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of Mental Health Matters for today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lenina Rasool. Goodbye.